Are we recording? Yes.
Yeah, we're recording, yeah.
Okay. So, hello everybody. Good morning. Today is October 24th, 2018. This is the bi-weekly, bi-monthly SIG API Machinery meeting. We are being hit by the weather. Some people is sick at home. Some people have sick kids at home. So, a lot of people is remote. Let me share the agenda for today. Hopefully everybody can see that. It's not super long, so we can start right away.
Can you zoom in somehow?
I can zoom in, yes.
Thank you.
No problem. So, Shisui Hu, are you online?
Yes.
Do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Let me show. Okay.
So before we start, can I just ask what kind of feedback you're hoping to get out of this group for this CAP?
Yeah. So first thing, I want to see if there's any objections on this proposal, and I want feedback on the right approach, which way we want to go. So basically, according to the feedback I already collected, there's a bunch the two approaches we can move forward. One is adding initializer into the namespace spec. The other is actually what you mentioned. We use a container meta structure for that. So this is my major purpose for this agenda. Shall we start?
Sure. I mean,
oh, go ahead, David.
I was gonna say I don't think we're gonna sign off on it in this SIG. Discussing it, it sounds reasonable, right? This is the
yes.
Initializer mechanism for namespaces that we said was going to be a prerequisite for going through and removing the alpha initializers feature, because namespace initializers were the only ones we could come up with that really had different use cases.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not looking for a sign off in this meeting. Yeah, so I will start from the use case why we needed this mechanism. So I assume people are familiar with existing initializers mechanism, which basically hold off the create request on a resource while initializer available and do the initialization work. So I don't know a lot of rationale behind the reason why we want to deprecate this initializers feature, but at least I find out this mechanism is very useful for namespaces, especially in shared cluster with a bunch of users who are not trusted completely, and the class admin doesn't want grant the users a lot of permission on cluster level, but only want to restrict them inside a namespaces. So with that use case, we want some mechanism when user comes in to create a namespace. We want some automated mechanism to populate the policies defined by the class admin into the namespace, and then grant the user with namespace admin privilege inside namespace, and basically that user can further create role binding inside the namespace for his team or whatever other members. That's the basic initiative for this namespace mechanism, initializing mechanism. So if we just move forward to create a controller, watch the namespace creation, and when the namespace gets created, we create policy object into the namespace. There's a problem which breaks the namespace create API behavior. So for example, when a user defining a manifest, which includes the namespace as the first resource, and all the following up resources are created inside the namespace. In this case, without initializers, the namespace gets created, and the kubectl will think the namespace is ready, and it moves forward to create further resources into the namespace. But before the namespace is properly initialized, for example, the creator may not get permission to create further resources into namespace, and the kubectl will fail on the next resource creation. So we need this initializer mechanism to basically hold the namespace creation request until all the initializers finish the work.
Okay, can we pause here?
Yes.
So that idea that you would hold the request, or that you would not try to create something in the namespace and then see it immediately fail, I would actually expect that for initialization, we would add to the namespace lifecycle admission plugin logic that says if it's not initialized, fail the request. So in your scenario, it would fail the request.
Right. It will fail the request for the creating resource inside namespace. Yeah, that's right.
Well, so I guess I'm saying that's the state today. I am expecting that would be the state after this work is done as well.
How would the namespace lifecycle admission distinguish between things that were taking part in the initialization and should be allowed to create things inside the namespace?
I think the basic point here is that there has to be some sort of permissions difference. Like there's groups or actors that are allowed to create objects and namespaces that are initializing, and people that aren't. And the problem isn't solved until there's some author permissions way of distinguishing those two groups.
But as an end user, I think I would still expect to see the next create fail. Right, so we solved this in the initializer design by having an initialize permission. It's an ability to update a thing. I guess we would have to have it also allow you to essentially bypass the admission plugin, but the concept would still be there. But I wouldn't expect end users to have it.
So there's two aspects there. One is whether a separate call to create something inside the namespace would be allowed or not. But then there's also the question of whether the initial create hangs until initialization is done.
I don't think it should.
So actually, I find this problem because some customers are complaining like they have their existing manifests. So by introducing a namespace initializer, if we don't hold the create, they have to rewrite their scripts, and things may get more complicated for them. So
I mean, you say rewrite the script. It's not like it works today, so.
Right. So there's a lot of scripts which basically assume when a namespace creation completes, it's ready for use. But actually, with initialization, it's not true.
So I guess going back to the thing I said earlier, if you've got this concept that you need to have some special permission to add things while the namespace is initializing, why can't we do that just by using our regular permissions model and only giving permission to the user after it is finished initializing?
That solves the problem of letting things in prematurely, but what we're trying to discuss is whether things that come in before it's initialized should get a forbidden error, or whether they should, like, their requests should be held until the...
Whoa, hold on. We're not talking about, like, the only request that's a candidate for being held is the request creating the namespace. Is that correct?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think while the namespace is initializing, if you don't have permissions to add things, you would get forbidden errors, is what I would expect.
Well, so one of the scenarios for supporting like a self-service namespace creation. So the cluster admin already grant the namespace get and create permission to a few users. So usually they are in a corp, represent a team lead or whatever. They have permission to create namespaces. they only have this permission, and we need automated mechanism like namespace population KEP mentioned. When a namespace gets created, the further role bindings are created inside namespace to grant this creator a namespace admin privilege, and he will be able to create objects or adding new more role bindings into the namespace after that. So that's the use case.
Creating a namespace is actually a fairly privileged thing still, right? It gives you control over the annotations that are used as hints to scheduling.
Yes.
I mean,
so so basically there's two ways currently today people are doing this thing. As one is basically people go through some process and ask the class admin to create namespace for them, and this is done basically asynchronously, and class admin can use any script or whatever to fully populate namespace, and then told the user, say, okay, it's ready, and you can come to use it. The other way is people want to save this overhead about this process and basically introduce the self-service namespace creation. So you can come in and just type kubectl create namespace, that's all. And wait until namespace gets ready, and they can move forward to directly create.
Well, I mean, there are alternative options, right? You can create an endpoint that will actually provision one for you based on a template to stamp out, right? We've had one for 4 years now, right? Like there are other options.
Yeah, definitely there's other options, and we can have a separate endpoint, but user will have to build a service behind this endpoint to do the namespace creation. So what we want to do is, if we can enable user just to use the kubectl and standard Kubernetes API to that job, that would be great.
So I guess what I haven't seen here is like, if we add this feature, you've still got to write controllers and give them a special initialized permission, and you've still got to write stuff to make it work. Plus you write this feature. If we don't add this feature, why can't you build this out of the existing tools we have today? That's the thing that I don't think I've understood yet.
Actually, the reason is explained in the namespace population KEP. So if we want to build, we can definitely use existing tools around today. But it seems like there's a bunch of options people can choose. And what I present here is try to give a, basically, how to say, a unified way to do the work and completely Kubernetes native. So just using the kubectl and use Kubernetes APIs without setting extra services. Like
you say it's explained in the KEP. Can you briefly summarize the explanation?
Sorry, what's the question?
I still haven't understood why you can't build this functionality with today's tools.
So there's a bunch of today's tools we can use. So the different people may choose different tools to do this work, and it doesn't come out as a consistent or unified user experience. So this proposal tried to define a simple and common user experience just using kubectl to create namespace. So that's the original idea for that.
But I'm sorry to keep saying the same thing. I still don't understand why you can't provide that with permissions modification plus a controller with today's tools.
Holding the namespace request, the namespace creation request, until other things have populated policy or things like that inside the namespace is not possible today. That is the one thing that cannot be done.
But is it necessary? That's the thing.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the feature. I'm interested in the feature, but I'm not interested in writing a bunch of logic to be able to hold the request until initialization is complete.
I mean, I'm saying, understand, I'm not opposed to the feature. I just think that we should justify it as like, you can't accomplish this without a feature. And I'm still not convinced that you can't accomplish this without a feature, because like, would we still want to hold the namespace creation request? I mean, if it's a choice between us adding a ton or improving a ton of logic in API server, and users adding a line in their script after they create the namespace that waits for the permissions, like by a condition on the namespace or something like that. Like, I like our users and I want their lives to be easy, but it's not clear that that's a good trade-off.
Yeah, the self-service creation.
So
go ahead.
So there's basically two thoughts behind that. The first thing is about by introducing some automation mechanisms, if we ask a user to do the work by themselves, they have to wrap a bunch of scripts themselves and find out the mechanism, how they can attest the namespace is ready and to move forward. This is one thing.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree with that, because we can add a standard namespace population controller that does the permissions twiddling for them.
In fact, I already linked to a project that has a project request endpoint that you can plug into Kube today.
Yes. So,
right.
Yeah,
the question is,
to be clear, I'm not suggesting the same thing that David is suggesting. I'm not suggesting a new endpoint that goes off and creates a namespace for you. I'm suggesting you create a namespace, you don't automatically get permissions on it. There's some component that does population, and then it grants you permissions on it. And there's
granting permissions to a person when you have a controller that can't see the original requester is that's not a thing that we can actually do today. Now, we have a controller that will actually perform initialization today on our namespaces, but you don't have access to the original creator.
Yeah, I kind of agree that it's not reasonable to ask people to go to another endpoint. That's a little strange, and it implies that your script won't be portable. I do think it is reasonable to say when you create a namespace, you have to wait a little bit before you can create the things that are inside the namespace. Just like today, if you create a CRD, you have to wait a little bit before you can make CRs. I think it's reasonable. Like most of our resources, we don't have a time-dependent aspect when you create them. Like you can create your pod and your config map at the same time, and that works fine. But I think it's reasonable to have an ordering requirement on your container and the things that are inside it.
And if we model the readiness or the completion of initialization as conditions, then something like the kubectl wait command could wait for that. So your script could create namespace, wait for namespace ready, then go do stuff with your namespace.
Yeah, so I guess like maybe granting permissions isn't quite the right model. Maybe we do need to define a special initialize phase, and even if you have permissions to create a namespace, you don't have permissions to add things until the initialize phase has been exited. But that doesn't mean we have to hold the request.
Yeah.
Right. So, my basic point is that this is a permissions problem, not a lack of features in API server problem.
It's permissions, but then it's also like usability for the people who have to script around it.
Right.
So as long as both of those are addressed, I think not holding it is simpler and cleaner.
Yeah, so basically that comes to a second problem. I haven't mentioned this. Currently today, we have no mechanism to wait for a namespace. We don't know when the namespace is ready because there's no status condition inside. Actually, I think holding on the creation request is not a good idea. But to solve the first request problem, like the user experience, the user don't need to change their current manifest and just smoothly move on with this new feature. This is the reason I raised this question. We need this holding. We needed to hold the create request. And for the second, we definitely needed this status condition. And we can have a plan like for quite long term when all the clients can be updated to be aware of this status condition. And then we don't need this. We don't need to hold the creation request anymore.
Yeah.
But to keep
I think that introducing the status condition along with initialization would make more sense. There are things today, like if you create a namespace and then immediately try to create a pod, it will fail because the service account for that namespace hasn't been provisioned yet. Like there are things today that have this behavior depending on what you're trying to do. So if you have a manifest that has a namespace and then a pod and do kubectl create, the pod will probably fail to create.
Yeah, I'm totally in favor of like adding status, adding conditions to namespace.
I would be too, but I really don't want to hold a request.
Agree.
Okay, sounds clear
Sounds like
to
we're
me.
all against that, actually, which surprises me because I thought I was in favor of it until a few minutes ago.
Yeah, so okay, I can adjust this the goals to introduce the state condition and with the initializer mechanism, but not holding the creation at the beginning. So at least I think we all agree that we need initializer mechanism, and we need a status condition. So holding the create request is still being questioned. So I think I'm okay with that. So can
Yeah,
we?
but I don't know that we need a do we need a initialized permission? Does that require changes to the namespace resource, or is that something that we can manage in other ways?
No, the permissions would be probably adding an RBAC role that allows it, and then adding some logic to the namespace lifecycle admission plugin that already exists.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm saying is, can we add a default permission plugin plus a new initialize verb or something, and then give the initializer that verb?
Typically, well, if we follow the same approach as we did for finalize, initializers remove themselves via a sub-resource, and that gets you all the permission stuff for free.
Well, that's the removal, but your point of you need to be able to create things in the namespace still holds.
Would you?
It depends on whether you consider it to be a security mechanism or not a security mechanism. And we have things that go in both directions. See limit ranges, quota, and quota versus roles and role bindings.
I think even if we don't plan for it to be a security mechanism, people will definitely use this as a security mechanism.
Yeah, which would lead me towards a separate permission.
Shall we introduce that today? So I think at the beginning, without this initialize verb, I think we can still with right RBAC setup to only grant the service count of the initializer controller to.
No, you never get to tighten permissions. So if we don't do it correctly the first time, we will never be allowed to tighten it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through the interactions of things today that observe namespace creation and start to populate. With the permissions they have today, they could do it. They would start getting denied until initializers are done. So this impacts more than just the creator of the namespace. It impacts anything observing namespaces.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything stock. OpenShift does.
Service account controller.
Cute. I would probably give that one powers, though.
Well, sure. Anytime we have to make adjustments in one part of the system to accommodate changes made somewhere else, that's a good place to stop and say, all right, our controllers are special only in that we maintain them and we know about the things they have to react to. Other people's controllers will be caught unawares on upgrade. I guess if a namespace
only if they turned on, only if they turned on the let me add initializers to the list.
Yeah.
I mean, and then even in cases where someone did that, it would eventually settle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and plus, it might actually be a better experience if the service account controller gets to do this before everybody else goes and creates their stuff, right?
Oh, definitely.
That wasn't a question. It was just like, let's say I wasn't OpenShift, I wasn't sitting on this call, and I got an update, and all of a sudden the controller that I maintain starts spewing errors.
Yeah, but they should be short-lived, and controllers are meant to recover. So,
yeah,
I agree. One of us likes users a lot.
Yeah.
So I guess the question would be, is the permission that lets the thing through the lifecycle admission while the namespace is initializing the same permission that lets it access the initializers list to remove itself?
It would feel natural to me.
It seems coherent.
Tim, I want to be mindful of time. We are already like half hour. into our meeting, there is more items, and I don't know if
Yeah, I agree. I think
Yeah, sure.
we should time box this, and I think the CAP probably needs another draft in light of what we all said here.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good to me. I will add the permission session into the proposal. And thanks everyone for discussing this.
Thank you.
Thanks. This was a great discussion.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So Jordan, I think you're next.
Okay. So it's everybody's least favorite topic. We talked a while ago, maybe a year ago or more, about behavior of disabled API fields. So these are new fields added to existing types that start out as alpha level and are not enabled by default. And then after some number of releases, can graduate to beta level, but can still be disabled by disabling the associated feature. So I linked a couple issues. The numbers are low. These issues came out a long time ago. And then kind of a document that laid out something that we thought could be a reasonable direction. Not a lot has happened around that document. And so to unblock people, there were a couple points during the object lifecycle where we started making use of feature gates. So one was in the prepare for create, prepare for update hooks. So before any object is created or updated, it goes through these methods. And this became a choke point for clearing out data from fields that were disabled. So the goal was that the server should behave as if this field doesn't exist. So when you're creating a new object, that generally is okay, right? If you're counting on using some new field and it gets dropped and that makes your object invalid, well, you get a validation error and you have to react to it. When updating, there are two scenarios. One is that the existing object isn't making use of this field. And in that case, dropping the field from your update is probably okay. That prevents new uses of this disabled feature. The use case we didn't really consider was if the existing object is using this disabled feature and maybe you're making an unrelated update, like removing a finalizer so you can delete this object. Dropping the fields in this case can produce invalid objects. And that can cause lots of problems, like being unable to delete objects or being unable to fix objects that were having problems, which is why you disabled the feature gate when you previously had it enabled. So we're running into this in a few places, trying to consider the impact on rollback. And if a feature has a problem and has to be disabled, like what do we do with the existing data in the system? And so I think what would make sense in prepare for update is to only drop the disabled field if the existing object also does not have the field set. So this prevents new use, but it tolerates existing use. And this is mostly in service of letting people update and clean up and delete these objects. So that's one place where we had hooked into object lifecycles. The second place was in validation. And previously, if you go look for how we use feature gates in validation, there's like 60, 70 references for validation of all these different objects that are saying, if this feature is disabled, fail validation if the related fields are set. And the problem is basically the same as with the prepare for update. If this is a new object coming in to be created, then really the field should be cleared. It should have been cleared in prepare for create. And if it made it through somehow, then failing is probably okay. But if this is an object that's being updated, then failing validation can prevent the kinds of changes that you need to make to delete the object. And so I'm all for belt and suspenders. I really liked having checks and validation just so I could be sure that no data associated with the disabled features ever made it in. But if we need to tolerate existing data to the degree that it can be cleaned up and deleted, and we are not always clearing the fields and prepare for update, then I think we have to stop checking feature gates in validation and count on the fields being cleared in the prepare for create, prepare for update when they should. This makes me a little bit unhappy because it means that code associated with a feature is only looking at presence of fields in the API objects and isn't completely inert if the feature is disabled. But I don't really see another way to handle the disablement or rollback case sanely. So I wanted to kind of describe that, see if there were people who had thought about this or encountered this or had other opinions about what we should do. And yeah, so also.
So Jordan, we discussed actually this in length. My question here is, I understand the principle that we want the feature gate to make the API server behave as the feature is not there at all, even the fields. I want to discuss this. What is the problem of validating if these fields are there and the feature gate is off? Why we don't just fail the requests? Why we are clearing them? And what's the problem of doing that actually?
So feature gates traditionally had a few goals. One was to let us do things in master before they were ready, and to gate off all of the code associated with that so that the API server behaved as if this feature and field did not exist. And so anything that lets the server return new error responses related to this feature was something we didn't want to have active. We
and I completely agree in that part. Auto clearing makes sense. But in this new world, we are not gating the whole thing. So we are letting some of the code runs and some of the objects that are currently using the feature continue to work. So the feature gate is not actually gating all of the code related to that feature.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that my goal would be for the server to behave as much as possible as if this feature does not exist. And so for new objects coming in where we don't have to be concerned with invalidating data already in etcd or breaking behavior already in progress, I would like it to continue ignoring the fields, ignoring the behavior, not letting the data in, and acting as if the field doesn't exist. I know we talked yesterday about what shows up in the OpenAPI schema when you have disabled a feature. I agree that it's a little bit incoherent to pretend like the field doesn't exist, but then still publish a schema that shows the field. That's not great. And I think that the doc that got linked to the Alpha Fields proposal was proposing a pretty comprehensive approach that would affect the schemas we publish and how we decode and the clients we generate. And like that, it would be great if all of those things worked together and were coherent. And it's not clear to me how possible that is given our decoding stack, how able we are to sort of fine-tune behavior. Like when you try to create an object, ignore this field completely, or warn if you try to set it. When you update or read from etcd, then tolerate and preserve. Like I'm skeptical that we can actually get the behavior we want in all the directions we want it. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm bringing it up here. Like there's what we're doing today. We know there are a couple problems with it. I'm hesitant to kind of throw out the entire approach of ignore the field. I'd like to try to just fix the rollback and update cases.
I wonder, you know, there's so many things that we could do, and we hashed out many of them when I was working on that design doc, which it's very funny that we never did anything with it. But we can imagine, what if we made it really easy to make an API group, like the types.go? What if we made it really low cost to duplicate that, and you put your field in a new group? Does that get us any improvements in this behavior at all?
A new group?
Sorry, not a new group, a new version.
Version.
Yeah.
Even if you had a new version, the new version would strip on, the old version would strip on storage, which seems like it would produce the same kind of illegal object Jordan brought up in the Arch call last week.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the best solution is never get into this situation. So
yeah,
never enable a feature until you know it will work and you won't have to roll it back. Never persist data and then disable the associated feature. That's the best solution.
I mean, in past things I've worked on, there's been like a 4-step dance, a 4-release dance if you want to change anything, where the first release you add the field to the schema but don't have anything touch it. The next release you like start populating it. The next release you make the default the new field, and but you still understand the old field if it's present, and then in the last release you can remove the old field. And I think that honestly we have to do something like that to solve this problem generally. Unfortunately, to follow that process in Kubernetes today, it takes an entire year. So this is one of the things that I mean when I say that the root of most of our problems in Kubernetes is the release cadence.
It's also information about, like, we don't have enough information about what is about to happen in the system or what has already happened in the system. All we have is a Boolean, like, is this feature on or off? We don't know things like, are you still wanting to be able to roll back to, you know, the previous version? Like, we don't have point of no return markers or controls or a way to say, all right, I'm happy on 112. You don't need to keep data out that would make it unsafe to roll back to 111 anymore.
Yeah, we could kind of compress the dance by having a flag flip, and like every release we expect you to do 2 rollouts. Like you roll out once, you wait 2 weeks for everything to stabilize, and you roll out again with like all the stuff turned on. That compresses it a little bit, I guess, but it at the cost of like confusing all cluster administrators everywhere.
Mm-hmm. You're running 112, but which 112 are you running? 112 with or without 112 features?
Right.
Okay.
I have Jordan, this is Chao. I ask a question. So in the rollback issue, you talked about why can't the users to delete the objects before disabling the feature?
So that's ideal. Depending on where the objects came from, it's racy, right? Like if you...
Well, it's also like the people who made the objects and the people who are turning the feature off are not the same people, so that's really not easy.
Yeah.
So for the racy point, you are saying like there are controllers creating the objects while you are trying to delete it. Is that what you mean? Then can you disable the feature gate on the controller, but keep the feature gate on the API server working?
We don't have like a global distributed place for the feature gates to go, so that's not easy.
It's sometimes it's a controller, sometimes it's just a user. I mean, what I'm trying to come up with is a set of recommendations or guidelines that will work kind of no matter whether it's a controller or a user or, yeah.
I think a try-state feature gate worth mentioning here too. We can say there's a state that everything works. There's a state that implementation works, but we don't accept new objects, and there's a state that the feature is disabled. Something like that. That can. I'm just saying that we can think about that, and then we can get rid of that race condition. So the feature is there, but the user are not allowed to add new objects for that feature.
So is that distinguishing between data and behavior, or is that distinguishing between new and existing objects?
I would say new and existing objects.
Can we have all the states? We have 4 states.
What's that?
Can we have all the states, like distinguish between existing and new, distinguish the behavior and data and their combination?
What was the last thing you said? Data implement. Oh, data and implement. I hadn't thought about enabling the data persistence separate from the implementation. That's interesting. It gets a little fuzzy when you talk about like validation, but anything acting on the data, that could be interesting.
So like once you turn on the allowing the data, you can never turn that off.
Yeah.
But then I am confused about how that would work in practice. Like if you take, say, CRDs with multiple versions, you allow the data to represent the multiple versions, but you turn off the flag that actually makes them function. I'm not sure. One of the general points that I usually make when this topic comes up is typically if you're turning off one of these flags, it's because something is wrong and you want to revert to a safer state. So that's really a bad time to be exercising untested code paths. And sort of definitionally, if you're doing this, it's because you're exercising some code path that wasn't adequately tested. So you know that the author of the thing you're trying to turn off didn't adequately test their code, which means they probably didn't adequately test the state in which it's disabled, but there was data already in the system. So I'm right, like the point of this functionality is to make clusters safer. So we should keep that goal in mind when we're designing a way to disable things.
I don't think the flag combination you said should be allowed. The data, allow data, but not the implementation. I think it should be something like, if we have distinguished between all existing and new objects, to roll back, you should do something like don't allow new objects, remove all existing objects, then set the feature flag once more, one level more to disable the implementation.
I mean, once you have persisted objects, you have no choice but to allow them. Like they exist.
I mean, part of the rollback can be, what Chao is suggesting. Part of the rollback can be you can roll back, you can disable the feature until you get rid of those objects.
We don't have a way to enforce that transactionally. So I think, like Daniel was saying, the reason you roll back, the reason you disable a feature after having enabled it is because there were problems. And so making people go through a checklist before they pull the trigger on rolling back isn't great. Like you want to be able to roll back immediately and then look at the objects that went sideways and work with them to delete them or revert them to the previous version or whatever.
Yeah, so that's why, and we should probably time box this because we've got one more agenda item, but that's why the thing that I'm advocating for is the feature gate prevents new usages of the feature, but it doesn't affect existing usages of the feature.
Yeah, that's the part I'm not clear about. When you say prevent new usages, that's the part is hazy to me because it's auto clearing. So this is my example. I have different operators that use the multi-versioning validation, for example, for CRDs. And as a user, I'm not aware when the cluster admin disabled the feature for some reason, for some problem. So I installed one of them, everything works. I have per version validation. So for some reason, cluster admin disabled the feature. I installed the second one. I think it works, but the API server auto-clear those fields for me.
So to be clear, I don't think it should, like if the field is set in an existing object, it shouldn't be cleared. It should only prevent you from setting it in
not
an
existing object. No, that's what I'm saying. No, it's not an existing object now. It's another operator. It's operator A, operator B. Now operator B, that is a new operator. I installed it. I don't know that somebody disabled the feature. It will be auto cleared as you guys are suggesting, because it's a create, it's a new object. And I think, I expect it to work, but it doesn't. My operator A has per version validation. My operator B does not have per version validation. Both in installation went through.
Yeah.
I didn't get any.
I think I'll bite that bullet and say that that's just the consequence of turning off a feature is like stuff that was using it continues to work, stuff that didn't use it previously can't start using it.
But what I'm saying
that
is
means,
why we are not failing the second installation? Why the validation is not failing the second installation? I still understand that we like the cluster to work as those feature is not existing at all.
Oh no, I think, sorry, I think it should, validation should fail if you try to add it or add a new object.
But that's not how feature gates work today. We are auto clearing those fields if the feature gate is off.
I think that means you cannot count on a new field added after an API version was introduced unequivocally. Like, you might be talking to a server that has that field available, or you might not. And so there are two things there. One is,
yes, sorry, just
pushing to stable versions, like getting the full definitions, especially for the custom resource stuff, getting the API flushed out, and then promoting to a V1 so that everyone who uses the V1 API can count on all of these fields existing. And the other is making sure the schema that we publish accurately reflects the fields that are enabled on the server.
Yeah, I basically don't think that it should fail silently if you attempt to use a feature that's turned off. I think it should tell you you can't do this.
Again, like we're wanting feature gates to do two things. One is to make the server behave the same way it did before this feature existed, which is to not know about this field, and your object works the way it works without this field. But then the other is to like make the code safe, and it can't serve both of those goals.
I think the first of those two things is kind of a pipe dream, right? Like there's different code in the server. It's very hard to be sure that the code behaves the same.
Should we pause here?
Yeah, let's move on. I don't think we're gonna settle this once and for all. Thanks for the discussion, though.
Okay. Hi, I'm Martin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have a question, or like more or less to have a discussion about webhooks. So normally with webhooks, you can specify like enable, namespace selector. And for example, if you have all your pods in one namespace labeled with some label, you'll be able to get the requests only for those pods. But if you have multiple pods, I mean, like the same pod in multiple namespaces, then your endpoint will get spammed by the API server with requests for objects that you probably don't care about. So I've looked into the cap for the webhooks, but I couldn't find any opposition for adding label selectors for individual objects. Is this a possibility, or?
I think we didn't add that to begin with because that allows the author of the object to determine whether it hits the webhook or not. And typically when people are adding webhooks, they want some certainty that all objects in some class of, like, over some criteria go through the webhook. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
Please, someone correct me if I'm remembering wrong.
No, I remember that, and I remember starting there because it only came up on cluster scoped things.
Yeah, we don't really have a good story for cluster scope things still,
Yeah,
I think.
but like inside of a namespace, it's the role of that namespace. Someone set labels on it one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah, and our story for namespace objects themselves is also a little weird.
Why can't the webhook itself just filter the objects based on label selector?
I mean, yeah, we're currently doing this, but first the API server is spamming a lot of objects. It's loading, for example, it's loading the admission requests for, like, for example, pods that should not be slowed. And for example, if our webhook fails for some reason, then we might break a lot of things. And yeah, there's also like this problem as well. And we've witnessed this thing.
I don't know if I like object to adding this because it is kind of wasteful to send a bunch of objects over the wire if you're just going to filter them out in the webhook. But we'd have to somehow make it extremely clear that this is like only suitable for certain classes of webhook.
I'm actually
I don't
trying
know.
to think what
that
kinds of webhooks it would be suitable for.
Yeah, I don't think I would ever expect this on a namespace scoped resource. On a cluster scoped resource, I still can't think of a way it would cause a cycle, except for maybe admission on a node. Has anyone ever written an admission plugin for a node? Jordan wrote an admission plugin for a node, but it was for auth.
Yeah, I think Martin, it might help us if you can say more about what your webhook is actually doing.
Okay, so pretty much it's checking, it's mutating one specific pod with one specific label. That's it, pretty much. And this pod is available across almost all namespaces, but it's not in the same namespace. So
I guess admission plugins that provide services that the object creator would want to be applied to their object. And so they would be wanting to opt in via some label or something.
Yeah, it's clearly an opt-in mechanism.
yeah, exactly.
I would probably still send it to the webhook, even though it's a little wasteful.
Yeah. I mean, the reliability concern is real. I am a little nervous about webhooks in general, just because it's like if you want to run some number of 9s in your control plane, all of your webhooks have to be that stable.
Yeah, that also has an opt-in has the interesting effect of making the admission plugin, like the annotation of the label or whatever you use to target it, that kind of becomes part of the API, which is interesting. Most of the admission stuff I've seen is more incidental. It's like you're creating a pod, you shouldn't care whether this admission plugin is enabled or not. It's gonna apply policy or make changes or do things, but like your pod should make sense whether or not this admission plugin is there, which isn't always. I mean, people do kind of opt in additional things. I think I saw something crazy where someone used an admission plugin to do templating, or so people would submit pods with specs that made no sense if this admission plugin wasn't there. I'm not sure if that's creative and
Before the
we want to enable or not.
Yeah, I actually kind of buy that reasoning. Like I do care that we help people write portable config.
No, I wasn't. Okay. But for the reliability argument, namespace selector is designed for that purpose. So.
No, namespace selector is designed to prevent you from having boot loops, cycles in your startup. It's not designed to, or it's not intended to reduce the traffic to your webhook to reduce the importance that your webhook is highly available.
Oh, so what do you mean by reliability then? I was thinking about, yeah.
Yeah,
Pod requests will fail if your webhook isn't up.
right. If you want like 4 nines or 5 nines on the number of requests that succeed, if all the requests are going through the webhook, that means the webhook has to have that many nines too, or more. If only a few requests go through the webhook, then it's easier to hit your SLO if the webhook is a little flaky. I mean, not that I would recommend that anyway, but still.
That basically means you should treat your webhook as part of your control plane and make sure it's
Not just,
as reliable as.
it's not just treated as, I mean, it is part of your control plane, right?
Exactly correct, yeah. The webhook is part of the control plane, and it needs to be run as such.
We have 1 minute left.
Martin, do you feel like that was a satisfactory discussion?
Oh, yeah, great.
Okay, great.
I mean, so Daniel, the one thing, and there are so many exceptions to this, I'm kind of loath to bring it up, but I mean, the one thing you can do to help with webhooks is you can have them fail open if what they're doing isn't such that skipping it means that things don't work.
Yeah, and I think we even have an option for that.
Yeah, we do. We have an option of whether the webhook fails open or fails closed in its config.
Yeah, but I don't know how much that helps, because if the thing you're providing is critical.
Yeah, that was my point of, if it doesn't matter if it fails open, if the thing is basically going to blow up after that. It's only a small subset of webhooks can even be set to fail open.
Yeah, and depending on what you do with it, setting it there can have really unintended consequences on your data.
Yep. I mean, in the template example, but yeah, agreed.
Okay, we're over time. I think we have a number of very good discussions today. Maybe Jordan, we can follow up on your discussion for the next meeting too.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that's it for today, unless anybody has anything else to bring up. Very good.
Bye, guys.
Have a very good Wednesday.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Hey, guys.
Actually, I have an idea on that.